My name is Aurora. I'm in my early 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of woman people describe as steady. Not loud, not dramatic. The one who remembers birthdays, pays bills on time, and fills in the gaps without being asked. If you met me briefly, you might think I'm reserved, maybe even a little too soft. The kind of person who avoids conflict. The kind who will always understand. That's how I was underestimated. I grew up believing that being dependable was the same as being loved. That if I made myself useful enough, calm enough, generous enough, I would earn safety. Over time, that belief shaped how my family saw me, and more importantly, how I saw myself. I became the background support system, the quiet problem solver, the one who could be counted on, but not necessarily considered. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about exposing anyone or turning my family into villains. There are no screaming matches here, no dramatic walkouts. What happened was quieter than that, and far more unsettling for everyone involved. It's about what changed when I stopped financing emergencies that never ended. When I stopped answering calls that only came with requests attached. When I said I can't anymore without raising my voice or explaining myself to exhaustion. That's when the story about me changed. Suddenly I wasn't dependable, I was selfish, I wasn't helpful, I was ungrateful. The moment I set boundaries, I became the villain in a story they created. One where my years of support were erased and my silence was treated like betrayal. This is a long story, because real shifts don't happen in a single argument. They happen through patterns, through small cuts that are easy to dismiss at the time, through moments you only understand in hindsight. It's a story about roles we're assigned without consent, and what happens when we quietly step out of them. I'm sharing this not to justify myself, but to tell the truth as cleanly as I can. There's no winner here. There is only clarity, earned slowly, and at a cost. If you've ever been the reliable one, the one people lean on without asking how much weight you're carrying, you might recognize parts of yourself in this. And as you listen, I want to ask you one gentle question to hold in the back of your mind. When did being generous start to feel like disappearing? To my family, I was never introduced by my name first. I was introduced by my function. She'll handle it. Ask Aurora, she's good with that. She won't mind. Those sentences followed me for years, said casually, almost affectionately, as if they were compliments. And for a long time, I treated them as such. I believed being relied on meant being valued. I believed consistency was a form of love. In family photos, I'm usually on the edge of the frame, slightly angled inward, smiling but not performing. The one who took the picture as often as she appeared in it. That positioning wasn't accidental. It mirrored my place in the family. Present, but peripheral. Essential, but not centered. I was the one who remembered details, who noticed when someone was struggling before they said anything. If money was short, I quietly adjusted my budget. If a bill was overdue, I covered it without an announcement. If emotions were high, I softened my voice, de-escalated, absorbed tension so others could stay comfortable. No one asked me to do these things outright. That's the part people misunderstand. I wasn't forced, I wasn't threatened, I was expected. And expectations, when left unspoken, are powerful. They disguise themselves as normal. Over time, my reliability became invisible. The more consistent I was, the less remarkable my effort seemed. Support, once repeated enough, stops looking like generosity and starts looking like obligation in the eyes of those receiving it. What they saw was someone who had it together, someone who didn't need much, someone who was fine. What they didn't see were the small calculations I made every month. The pauses before opening messages. The way I learned to separate what I felt from what I showed was by showing exhaustion, which made people uncomfortable. I learned early that my family responded best to my calm, my composure, my lack of needs. When I was steady, everything worked better. When I was quiet, no one worried. So I stayed quiet. I told myself this was maturity, that this was what being the strong one looked like. I told myself that someday, when things stabilized, there would be room for me too. But stability, I learned, is a moving target when other people benefit from your flexibility. There was an unspoken hierarchy in my family, voices that were listened to, emotions that were accommodated, crises that were treated as urgent. Mine rarely made the list, not because they were smaller, but because I handled them privately. That became part of the myth of me. Aurora doesn't need help. Aurora is fine. Aurora can take care of it. And myths once formed are hard to challenge without consequences. I didn't resent them then. That's important to say. I wasn't keeping score. I wasn't secretly angry. I was simply playing the role that had been quietly written for me, the one that earned approval without demanding space, the reliable one, the reasonable one, the one who wouldn't make things difficult. Looking back, I can see how that role benefited everyone. But me, at the time though, it felt safer to be useful than to be seen, safer to be dependable than to be honest about my limits. Because usefulness was rewarded, while needs were treated like inconveniences. So when people ask why this didn't change sooner, this is the answer. There was no single moment where I was mistreated in a way dramatic enough to protest. There were only patterns. And patterns are easy to excuse when they're familiar. I was valued for what I provided, not for who I was. And as long as I kept providing, everything stayed peaceful. Until it didn't. The first time something shifted, it was so small that I almost missed it. There was no argument, no raised voice, no clear offense I could point to later and say, this is where it began. That's the thing about the earliest boundary violations. They arrive quietly, disguised as practicality, wrapped in familiarity. It was a financial request, not unusual. It came packaged as an assumption rather than a question, delivered with that familiar tone that suggested I would understand. I always did. I remember reading the message and feeling a brief pause inside my chest. Not panic, not anger, just hesitation, a small internal check I wasn't used to performing. The numbers worked, technically. I could cover it. But covering it meant rearranging things I had been carefully building for myself, plans I hadn't shared because they didn't seem urgent enough to announce. So I asked a simple question. One sentence, calm, clarifying. The response came back light, almost joking, as if my hesitation were amusing, as if the idea that I might need to think about it was unexpected. That was the cut, not the request, the reaction. It was the first time I noticed that my cooperation had been assumed so completely, that my pause felt like a disruption, that my role wasn't just to help, but to help without friction. I said yes anyway. That part matters. I didn't draw a line. I didn't confront anyone. I transferred the money, adjusted my plans, and told myself I was overthinking it. But something had changed. A quiet awareness settled in, the kind you can't unlearn once it appears. After that, similar moments started to stand out. Comments made casually. Decisions were made without consulting me, even when they involved my resources. Gratitude is expressed vaguely, if at all. It wasn't cruelty, it was comfort. The comfort of knowing I would handle it. Everyone else ignored these moments because they weren't dramatic. They didn't interrupt family gatherings or create tension. They fit neatly into the existing rhythm. I was the only one who felt the disruption because it happened inside me. I began to notice how often my contributions were treated as a given, while others' efforts were praised for being exceptional. How quickly inconvenience traveled downward in the family, landing where it always had, on me. Still, I stayed quiet. I told myself this was what generosity looked like, that keeping the peace mattered more than naming discomfort. That love wasn't transactional, so why was I counting? But I wasn't counting favors. I was noticing patterns. That first small cut didn't hurt much. It didn't bleed. It didn't demand attention. But it marked the moment I realized my willingness had become a resource others felt entitled to manage. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. I didn't say anything. I didn't pull away. I didn't change how I showed up. Yet. I just remembered. Once you notice a pattern, your mind starts doing something dangerous. It tries to protect the story you've been living in. I didn't confront what I was seeing right away. Instead, I explained it away. I softened the edges in my own head. I told myself everyone was stressed, that timing was bad, that I was being too sensitive, reading meaning into things that weren't meant personally. This is how disrespect becomes normalized, not through cruelty, but through repetition, paired with rationalization. The requests kept coming, not always for money, but for time, emotional labor, and attention. I became the person people unloaded on after they'd exhausted everyone else. The one expected to listen calmly, respond thoughtfully, and fix what could be fixed without making it awkward. What changed was how automatic it all felt, to them. Plans were made with the assumption that I would adjust mine. Decisions were discussed after they were already finalized. My agreement was implied, not requested. And when I hesitated, even briefly, there was a subtle shift in tone, confusion, mild annoyance, as if I had broken an unspoken contract. No one ever said, "You owe us." They didn't have to. The language was softer than that. "It's just easier this way. You're better at handling these things. You don't have as many complications." Those statements sound neutral, even flattering, but they carry weight. They quietly define whose time matters more, whose energy is considered abundant, whose life is flexible enough to absorb impact. I absorbed it. I kept telling myself that being understanding was a virtue, that family dynamics are messy, that love means compromise. And every time I swallowed my discomfort, it became easier for everyone else to forget it existed. What I didn't realize then was that silence doesn't maintain balance. It teaches people what they can do without consequence. The more I stayed quiet, the more my boundaries dissolved in their minds. Not because they were malicious, but because they were comfortable. Comfort dulls awareness. I remember sitting in conversations where plans were being discussed that directly involved me, watching them unfold as if my presence were a formality rather than a variable. I would nod, smile, say, "That should be fine," even when I hadn't been asked. Later, alone, I would feel a low, persistent ache. Not anger, something closer to grief. A sense that I was slowly becoming a role rather than a person. Still, I didn't push back. Part of me was afraid that if I did, the harmony would break, and that I would be blamed for the noise. I had spent so long being the calm center that the idea of disrupting it felt like failure. So I adjusted. Again. I rearranged my priorities again. I told myself this was temporary, that once things settled, I would speak up. But once things settle is a promise that never arrives when other people benefit from your adaptability. By then, the disrespect didn't look like disrespect anymore. It looked normal, expected, efficient. And I was the only one who felt how much it cost. I didn't wake up one morning and realize I had been assigned a role. It revealed itself slowly, through repetition, until it became impossible to ignore. I was the reliable one. Not in the way that earns admiration, but in the way that creates dependency. The one whose life could be adjusted without much discussion. The one who would step in quietly when something went wrong, and step back just as quietly once it was handled. What struck me wasn't that my family needed support. Families do. It was that my support had become structural. Things were planned around it. Risks were taken because I existed as a safety net. And safety nets, I learned, are rarely thanked once they're assumed to be permanent. The role came with expectations I had never agreed to out loud. Emotional steadiness, financial flexibility, immediate availability, minimal needs. If I met those expectations, everything ran smoothly. If I didn't, even briefly, the discomfort spread. I started to notice how quickly tension arose when I wasn't instantly accommodating. How small boundaries were met with subtle disappointment. Not anger, confusion. As if the version of me they knew had malfunctioned. That was when it became clear. I wasn't being related to as an equal. I was being used as infrastructure. Infrastructure doesn't get asked how it feels. It just gets relied on. There was an unspoken narrative in my family about who was allowed to struggle and who wasn't. Some people were going through things. Their needs were centered, their emotions protected. Others, like me, were expected to remain steady so the system could keep functioning. I didn't fit into the category of someone who needed care because I had spent years proving I could manage without it. And so, without anyone saying it directly, I became the one who would always handle it. What hurt wasn't the role itself, it was how invisible it made me. My sacrifices weren't dramatic enough to notice. They were small, consistent, and therefore easy to overlook. I began to understand something uncomfortable. As long as I stayed in this role, my worth would be measured by how little trouble I caused, not by how fully I lived. Still, I didn't rebel. I didn't announce a change. I didn't demand recognition. I observed. I watched how quickly gratitude faded into expectation. How easily my boundaries were tested and then ignored. How the idea of my limits made people uneasy, as if limits were a betrayal of who I was supposed to be. That's when I realized the role wasn't just assigned, it was defended. Not aggressively, but through resistance to change. Any shift in my behavior threatened the balance everyone else had grown comfortable with. So I stayed quiet, but not unaware. I started paying attention to how often my own needs were postponed for the sake of keeping things easy. How often I told myself later and never came back to it. How much of my identity had been shaped around being useful rather than being whole? This wasn't anger yet. It was clarity. And clarity, once it arrives, doesn't leave you alone. The day something shifted wasn't dramatic. No argument. No breaking point that anyone else could point to and say, that's when Aurora changed. It was an ordinary day, which is why it stayed with me. I was sitting alone at my kitchen table, a mug of coffee going cold in front of me, reviewing my finances the way I did every month. Numbers, timelines, obligations, most of them familiar. But that morning, something felt different. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't multitasking. I was fully present with what I was seeing. And for the first time, I didn't just see numbers. I saw patterns. I saw how much of my income had quietly flowed outward over the years. How often my goals had been delayed to stabilize someone else's crisis. How many temporary arrangements had stretched into permanence without conversation. It wasn't panic that hit me. It was stillness. A simple, unsettling question formed in my mind. If I stop, what happens? Not if I disappear. Not if I refuse everything. Just if I stop absorbing what was never meant to be mine alone. I realized that no one had ever asked me how long I could do this. They had only asked whether I could. That distinction mattered. In that quiet moment, I understood something else just as clearly. I had been waiting for permission to change a role that only existed because I kept performing it. No one was going to release me from it. Not because they were cruel, but because they didn't need to. The system worked for them. That's when the internal shift happened. Not anger, not resentment. Responsibility, directed inward for the first time in a long while. I didn't make any announcements that day. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't even change my behavior yet. What changed was my internal posture. I stopped framing my needs as inconveniences. I stopped assuming that peace required my self-erasure. I stopped believing that love had to be proven through endurance. That morning, I wrote something in my notebook. Nothing poetic, just a line that grounded me. Support is a choice, not an obligation. Seeing it written down made it real. From that point on, every interaction carried a new layer of awareness. I noticed when requests came without curiosity, when gratitude was implied rather than expressed, when my silence was interpreted as consent. I still said yes sometimes, but the yes felt different. It was conscious, temporary, measured. The shift wasn't visible to anyone else yet. But inside me, something had moved into alignment. And once that happens, returning to who you were becomes impossible. After that day, my silence changed in quality. Before, it had been reflexive, automatic, a way to keep things smooth without thinking too hard about the cost. Now, it has become deliberate, measured. I stopped filling every pause, stopped explaining myself preemptively, stopped rushing to reassure people that everything was fine. And because the external behavior looked almost the same, no one noticed. First, I still showed up. I still listened. I still responded politely, but I no longer volunteered solutions the moment a problem appeared. I let questions sit unanswered a little longer. I asked for time before agreeing to anything that involved my resources. What surprised me was how uncomfortable that made people. Not openly, subtly. There were longer pauses on the other end of the phone. Follow-up messages that carried a hint of impatience. Jokes about me being busy now. Comments framed lightly, but edged with expectation. They mistook my quiet for hesitation, for weakness, for uncertainty. In reality, it was discipline. I was learning to tolerate the discomfort of not smoothing things over, to let other people feel the weight of their own requests, to sit with the knowledge that I didn't owe immediate access to my energy, my time, or my money. This wasn't punishment. It wasn't a strategy yet. It was recalibration. I started to see how quickly people fill silence with assumptions, how they interpret delayed responses as resistance rather than reflection, how accustomed they had become to my instant availability. Still, I said nothing. Said nothing about what was changing inside me. Because silence, when chosen, reveals more than confrontation ever could. It shows you who notices the difference, who adjusts, who presses harder. Some people adapted. They asked more clearly. They checked in. Those moments stood out, not because they were loud, but because they were rare. Others didn't. They escalated, not aggressively, but persistently, reframing needs as emergencies, layering requests with emotional context, as if adding urgency would restore the old version of me. and that told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't being valued for my presence. I was being valued for my responsiveness. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. I stopped offering explanations for my delays. I stopped justifying my limits. I allowed my no's to be simple and my yeses to be intentional. From the outside, nothing looked dramatic. No bridges burned, no lines drawn in the sand. But internally, I was stepping out of the role one quiet decision at a time. And the silence, my silence, became a mirror. While everything looked the same on the surface, something else was happening underneath, something no one noticed, because no one was looking for it. I began preparing. Not in a dramatic way. There were no secret meetings, no grand plans unfolding overnight. Preparation, for me, looked like observation paired with documentation. It looked like learning without announcing that I was learning. It looked like reclaiming my attention. I started tracking what I had never tracked before. Not to build a case against anyone, but to understand the reality I had been living inside. I reviewed years of bank statements, not with bitterness, but with clarity. I categorized support that had been labeled temporary. I noted patterns, frequency, timing, urgency, how often my help had arrived just in time to prevent consequences for someone else. I also paid attention to conversations, to how requests were framed, to those who spoke when money or responsibility came up, and who went quiet. I noticed how quickly people assumed I would step in if silence stretched too long. They didn't notice me noticing. At the same time, I invested in myself quietly. I deepened my financial literacy. I spoke to professionals, not about my family, but about my future. I learned the difference between generosity and enablement, between support and substitution. Emotionally, I did something just as important. I stopped explaining my inner world to people who benefited from not understanding it. That was new for me. I journaled consistently, not to vent, but to anchor myself in facts. What was said, what was promised, what actually happened. Writing it down stripped away the emotional fog. It made patterns undeniable. What struck me most was how little resistance there was to my quiet withdrawal of excess. Because it was gradual, because it wasn't announced, because it didn't threaten anyone. Yet. People often think power announces itself. In my experience, it accumulates silently. They didn't notice that I was no longer structuring my life around potential emergencies, that I was building margins, financial, emotional, temporal, that I was imagining futures that didn't require me to be constantly available. They still saw the old version of me, dependable, calm, present. What they didn't see was that I was no longer dependent on being needed. And that shift, internal, invisible, was the most important preparation of all. Because once you no longer need the role, you can finally choose whether to play it. The reveal wasn't a confrontation. It didn't happen across a table or in a heated exchange. No one else was present when it happened. It was private, and it was final. One evening, as I sat with the records I had been quietly organizing, notes, timelines, numbers laid out with a calm precision, I saw the full picture all at once, not emotionally, logically. I realized that my support hadn't just been helpful. It had been foundational. Certain decisions had been made because I existed in the background. Risks had been taken because someone assumed I would soften the landing. Consequences had been delayed because I absorbed them before they could arrive. This wasn't about gratitude or lack of it anymore. It was about structure. And I was holding a load that no one else even acknowledged was heavy. The clarity was almost unsettling. There was no rush of triumph, no sense of superiority, just a clean understanding. If I stepped back fully, the system would not collapse, but it would be forced to rebalance. For the first time, I saw my leverage clearly, not as a weapon, as a fact. My leverage was not secrets or ultimatums. It was my consistent presence and the absence of it. I understood then why my smallest hesitations had caused discomfort. Why had my pauses been met with confusion? They weren't reacting to me changing. They were reacting to stability weakening. And that knowledge changed how I saw everything. I didn't feel powerful in a dramatic way. I felt responsible, because leverage carries ethical weight. It asks you to choose carefully, not emotionally. So I made a decision in that moment, sitting alone with nothing but facts in front of me. Whatever I did next would be clean. No manipulation, no punishments disguised as boundaries, no explaining myself into exhaustion. Just alignment. I closed the notebook. I took a breath, and I accepted a truth that was uncomfortable but necessary. I could no longer support a system that required my self-erasure to function. That was the reveal. Quiet, unshared, but irreversible. Clarity is not gentle. It doesn't shout, but it doesn't negotiate either. Once it arrives, it rearranges everything. Quietly, permanently. After the private reveal, I didn't act immediately. I let the understanding settle into my body, not just my mind. I wanted to be sure that what I was about to do wasn't a reaction, but a decision. There's a difference. Reactions seek relief, decisions accept cost. I laid out every option in front of me with a kind of unemotional honesty I had never practiced before. I could continue exactly as I had been, just with clearer eyes. Many people do that. They learn the truth and decide the price is worth it. That path promised predictability, familiar roles, no disruption, but it also guaranteed something else, that every future yes would carry resentment I could no longer pretend wasn't there. I could attempt reform, sit everyone down, explain the imbalance carefully, use language about boundaries, burnout, and sustainability. Hope for understanding, hope for change. But hope is a fragile foundation when power dynamics are involved. I knew how those conversations would go, not because my family was uniquely flawed, but because systems resist disruption. The focus would shift quickly, from what I had carried to how I was expressing it, from structure to tone, from truth to damage control. I would be heard, but not changed for. And then there was the third option, the one I avoided naming at first because it felt too final. I could withdraw, not partially, not experimentally, fully. I could remove myself from the role that had defined me for years and allow the system to experience life without my constant intervention. I could stop financing outcomes I had no control over, stop cushioning decisions I didn't make, stop rescuing situations that repeat because rescue was guaranteed. That option didn't require buy-in. It didn't require understanding. It didn't require permission. It only required resolution. What made this decision point so heavy wasn't fear of conflict. It was grief. Grief for the version of myself who believed that being indispensable was the same as being loved. Grief for the fantasy that if I just explained myself well enough, everyone would suddenly see me clearly. I sat with that grief instead of pushing it away. And in that stillness, something became undeniable. Staying would cost me more than leaving ever could. Not leaving the family, but leaving the role. I realized that if I softened this boundary to make it easier for others, I would be choosing their comfort over my integrity. And I had done that for years already. So I made the decision quietly, without ceremony. I decided that I would no longer provide financial support. Not as leverage, not as a lesson, as a limit. I also decided something equally important. I would not justify this decision beyond a simple statement of fact. No spreadsheets, no historical breakdowns, no emotional appeals. I would not put my truth on trial. That was the irreversible part. Because once you stop explaining, you stop negotiating your own reality. I rehearsed the words privately. Not to sound strong, but to sound clear. I won't be able to help with that anymore. This isn't something I can continue. I've made a decision. No apology, no qualifiers, no future promises disguised as comfort. I understood then that the fallout wouldn't come from what I was doing, but from what I was no longer willing to do. And I accepted that. That acceptance marked the real turning point. The moment where the old version of me, who stayed to preserve harmony at any cost, stepped aside. What came next would test that decision. But the decision itself was already complete. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel relief. I felt gravity, because choosing differently is one thing. Living with the consequences of that choice, especially when no one else knows it's coming, is something else entirely. I didn't announce my withdrawal. There was no family meeting, no long message, no emotional framing. I understood something crucial by then. The people who benefited most from my silence would use any explanation as an opening to negotiate it away. So I moved in silence. Silence in this phase didn't mean absence. It meant precision. I reviewed every recurring obligation I had quietly absorbed over the years. I separated what was legally mine from what I had taken on out of habit. I adjusted automatic transfers. I closed open-ended arrangements that had no clear end date. Each action was small, administrative, almost boring. But together, they restructured my life. I didn't replace one system with another. I simply removed myself from the center of theirs. What surprised me most was how calm I felt while doing it. No shaking hands, no racing heart, just focus, the kind that comes when your internal and external realities finally align. I prepared for pushback, not emotionally, but practically. I reviewed my language. I practiced saying no without justification. I reminded myself that discomfort was not danger. And then I waited. At first, nothing happened. That's the part people don't talk about. When you step back quietly, there's often a delay. Systems don't fail immediately. Momentum carries them forward for a while. People assume things will resolve the way they always have. I let that assumption exist. I didn't rush in when hints appeared. A comment here, a casual mention there. Things are a little tight right now. I listened. I acknowledged. I didn't intervene. That restraint took more strength than any confrontation ever had, because stepping in would have been easy, familiar, rewarded. But every time I felt the old reflex rise, the urge to smooth, to fix, to quietly absorb, I reminded myself of something I had written weeks earlier. Support without consent becomes self-betrayal. So I stayed still. Behind the scenes, I continued fortifying my own foundation. I increased my savings. I finalized plans I had postponed for years. I allowed myself to imagine a future that wasn't built around contingency. I also prepared emotionally for something I knew was coming, even if I didn't know when. A narrative shift. When people lose access to a resource they've normalized, they don't usually examine their dependency first. They examine the resource. I knew that once the effects became undeniable, the story about me would change. And I made peace with that before it happened. I accepted that I would be misunderstood, that my silence would be interpreted as coldness, that boundaries would be reframed as abandonment. This wasn't pessimism, it was realism. Moving in silence meant I didn't correct those interpretations. I didn't rush to explain myself into palatability. I let people sit with their confusion. What they didn't know and couldn't see was how carefully I had ensured that my withdrawal caused no immediate harm. I wasn't cutting anyone off mid-crisis. I wasn't leaving chaos behind me. I was simply no longer preventing natural consequences from arriving. That distinction mattered to me. Ethically, I needed to know I wasn't punishing anyone. I was opting out. There were moments late at night when doubt crept in. Not about the decision, but about how alone it made me feel. There is a particular loneliness that comes with no longer being needed, especially when your identity has been shaped around that need. But even that loneliness felt cleaner than the quiet resentment I had lived with before. As weeks passed, the atmosphere began to shift. Conversations changed tone, requests became more direct and more urgent. There was less casualness, more edge. I noticed how often my name came up when plans unraveled. Still, no one confronted me directly. That was telling. Direct confrontation would have required acknowledging how much I had been carrying. And that acknowledgement threatened the old story, the one where I was simply fine. So instead, the pressure came indirectly, through implication, through guilt, through subtle reminders of how things used to be. I didn't react. Moving in silence meant trusting the process I had set in motion. It meant allowing discomfort to exist without rushing to neutralize it. It also meant noticing something else, something unexpected. Without my constant intervention, other people began stepping forward. Not perfectly, not gracefully, but they did. Responsibilities redistributed, decisions slowed, reality reasserted itself. The system didn't collapse, it adjusted. And that confirmed what I had already known deep down. My presence had been helpful, but it had also been enabling stagnation. By removing myself quietly, I wasn't destroying anything. I was allowing growth to occur where it had been delayed. Still, the emotional reckoning hadn't arrived yet. I could feel it approaching, not like a storm, but like pressure building behind a sealed door. Silence had done its work, and soon it would be noticed. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They arrived unevenly, quietly, in fragments. At first, they showed up as an inconvenience, a bill that couldn't be delayed anymore, a plan that no longer worked without adjustment, a conversation that ended awkwardly because no one quite knew how to proceed, small disruptions that felt irritating rather than alarming. And still, no one connected them to me. That's the thing about long-standing support. When it disappears, people don't immediately recognize the absence. They feel the effects first, not the cause. Like a building that suddenly feels colder, but no one thinks to check whether the heat has been turned off. I noticed the change in tone before anything else. Messages became shorter, less casual, less warm. There was a new edge beneath them, not hostility, but strain. The kind that forms when people are forced to pay attention to things they've long avoided managing themselves. I was still spoken to, as if I were available, as if my role had not changed. But now there was uncertainty underneath the assumptions. Things are kind of complicated right now. We're trying to figure something out. It's just been a lot lately. They said these things the way people do when they expect a familiar rescue to follow. It didn't, and that's when the discomfort deepened. What surprised me wasn't that they struggled. It was how confusing that struggle seemed to be for them, as if hardship had appeared out of nowhere rather than emerging from years of deferred responsibility. I watched quietly as people began having conversations they'd never needed to have before. Budget discussions, trade-offs, decisions that required compromise instead of assumption. There was frustration, but it wasn't directed at me yet. First, it turned inward, toward circumstances, toward bad timing, toward everything except the structure that had changed. That stage didn't last long. Soon, my absence started to take shape in their minds. Not as a neutral fact, but as a problem that needed explaining. And when people don't understand a change, they invent a story to contain it. That's when I felt the temperature shift. Questions started arriving that weren't really questions. Are you okay? You seem distant. You've changed. These weren't expressions of concern. They were probes, attempts to locate the old version of me and pull her back into place. I answered kindly, briefly, truthfully, but selectively. Yes, I'm fine. I've been focused on my own things. No, nothing's wrong. Each response landed heavier than I expected. Not because of what I said, but because of what I didn't offer. No apology, no reassurance, no explanation. And that absence made people uneasy. The consequences escalated slowly from inconvenience to pressure. There were hints now. Comparisons to the past. Nostalgic references to how we used to handle things. Stories told in a way that subtly positioned me as the missing solution. I recognized the tactic, not as manipulation, but as habit. People reach for what has worked before. Still, I didn't step in, because stepping in now would have rewritten the lesson entirely. It would have taught them that persistence eventually overrides boundaries. I wasn't trying to teach, but I wasn't willing to erase reality either. Behind the scenes, the strain became more visible. Deadlines missed, plans downsized, tensions between family members who were now forced to negotiate with each other instead of defaulting to me. The emotional labor I had once absorbed quietly began redistributing, awkwardly, unevenly. And with redistribution came resentment. Not toward the system, toward me. I began to sense it before I heard it directly. In the way my name was mentioned, in the pauses after it, in the slight defensiveness that crept into conversations that hadn't required defensiveness before. I had become a variable. That was new. Eventually, the narrative sharpened. I was no longer just busy. I was withholding. I was choosing not to help. And choice, when attached to support people feel entitled to, is deeply unsettling. That's when the word ungrateful appeared for the first time, indirectly. Not said to me, but around me, filtered through tone and implication. The irony didn't escape me. Years of giving had been invisible. One sustained boundary was now defined. Still, I didn't correct the story, because by then, I understood something fundamental. Any explanation I offered would only be used to argue me back into position. So I let the consequences continue, not out of cruelty, out of integrity. The system was adjusting, painfully, imperfectly, but honestly, and I was finally on the outside of it. Watching, breathing, breathing, holding my ground. That was when I knew the hardest part was still ahead. By the time panic set in, the window for quiet repair had already closed. At first, the urgency disguised itself as concern. Voices softened. Messages arrived more frequently. There was a renewed interest in how I was doing, how work was going, and whether I was holding up okay. It would have been easy to mistake it for care if I hadn't already learned how timing reveals intent. What they were really asking was whether I was still accessible. When reassurance didn't come in the form they expected, the tone shifted again. The conversations grew more direct, less subtle. The problems were no longer hinted at. They were laid out plainly, accompanied by a familiar expectation that I would recognize the moment and step in. But I didn't. That was when confusion turned into panic. I could hear it in the rushed explanations, the way situations were suddenly framed as urgent, unavoidable, exceptional. Every issue was presented as a one-time crisis, unrelated to the last. A string of emergencies, each deserving special consideration. What they didn't realize was that I could now see the pattern clearly, and patterns lose their power once they're named internally. There were attempts to renegotiate the past, to remind me of everything the family had done for me, to reframe my years of support as something mutual, balanced, and even generous toward me. It wasn't malicious, it was self-protective. When systems start to fail, people look backward, searching for leverage. I listened. I acknowledged feelings. I didn't argue the facts, but I didn't reopen the door. That was when the language hardened. Disappointment turned into accusation. Confusion into moral framing. I wasn't just unavailable anymore. I was wrong, ungrateful, selfish, cold. The moment I set boundaries, I became the villain in the story they created. What struck me was how quickly my entire history was rewritten. Years of quiet support were minimized or erased. The narrative compressed until only my absence remained. And still I stayed calm. Because by then, there was nothing left to fix. Not without returning to a version of myself I no longer inhabited. The panic wasn't about losing me. It was about losing what I made possible. And once that's gone, no amount of urgency can recreate it. The confrontation, when it finally came, did not look the way people imagine confrontations. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no dramatic declarations. It happened in a quiet space, at an ordinary time, when exhaustion had stripped everyone of the energy required for performance. By then, the tension had been sitting between us for weeks. Unspoken, but dense. The kind that settles into conversations and makes every sentence carry more weight than it should. We all knew why we were there. No one needed to name it. They spoke first, not angrily, carefully, as if choosing the right tone might restore something that had already shifted beyond reach. They talked about family, about how we've always handled things together, about how things had become difficult recently, about how my distance had been felt, how it was hurting people. I listened without interrupting. That alone seemed to unsettle them, because they were used to me responding quickly, reassuring, clarifying, softening. My silence forced them to keep going, to fill the space with their own words. And the longer they spoke, the clearer the shape of the problem became. Eventually, someone said it plainly. Write it plainly. You've changed. I nodded. Not defensively, not apologetically, just acknowledgement. Yes, I said, I have. That was it. No explanation followed. They waited for one. I could feel it. The collective expectation that I would now justify myself. That I would outline my reasoning in a way that could be debated, reshaped, and negotiated. But I didn't, because I understood something crucial by then. Explanations invite counter-arguments. Boundaries do not. When I did speak again, my voice was steady, almost quiet. I can't support things the way I used to, I said. That's not something I'm willing to revisit. There was a pause, a long one. Then came the questions. Why now? Why this way? Didn't I see how hard things were? Didn't family mean helping each other? Each question carried an implicit accusation. That my boundary was a moral failure rather than a personal limit. I didn't counter their points point by point. I didn't bring out records, timelines, or evidence. I didn't defend my past or argue for my worth. I said only what was necessary. I helped because I chose to, I said. And I'm choosing differently now. That was when frustration surfaced. Not explosive, but sharp. A crack in the calm. That doesn't seem fair. I looked at them then. Really looked. Fair, I said gently. To whom? Silence followed. Not the uncomfortable kind. The revealing kind. Because fairness, when examined closely, requires acknowledging imbalance. And imbalance was the one thing no one wanted to name. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't list sacrifices. I didn't say how tired I had been or how invisible I had felt. Those truths were real, but they weren't needed in that moment. What mattered was that I didn't flinch. Not when disappointment showed. Not when guilt was implied. Not when the past was selectively remembered. I stayed calm because I wasn't asking for understanding anymore. I was informing them of reality. At some point, someone said, "So that's it." I nodded again. Yes. No anger, no satisfaction, just finality. That was the moment they understood. Not emotionally, but structurally, that the old dynamic was gone. They didn't leave happy. They didn't leave feeling resolved. But neither did I feel shaken. Because confrontation without heat doesn't aim to win. It aims to end confusion. And it did. After everything settled, After the silence, the confrontation, the rebalancing, I expected to feel something dramatic. Relief, triumph, maybe even grief. What I felt instead was space. Not the empty kind, the honest kind. For the first time in years, my days weren't shaped around potential disruptions. I no longer lived in a state of low-grade anticipation, waiting for the next request, the next problem I'd be expected to solve quietly. My calendar belonged to me. My money followed my values. My energy was no longer pre-spent. That freedom didn't arrive with fireworks. It arrived with calm. And calm, I learned, can feel unfamiliar when your nervous system has been trained to stay alert. At first, I had to resist the urge to fill the space, to volunteer, to offer, to check in excessively. Old habits don't disappear just because you understand them. They loosen slowly, through practice. So I practiced. I practiced letting messages sit without rushing to respond. I practiced saying I can't without adding an apology. I practiced noticing when guilt appeared and not obeying it. The most profound change wasn't external, it was internal. I no longer measured my worth by my usefulness. That shift affected everything. I became more selective. Not colder, but clearer. I gave support where it was mutual, where it didn't require me to disappear. I stopped over-explaining myself to people who were uncomfortable with my limits. I allowed misunderstandings to exist without scrambling to correct them. Some relationships softened, others faded. A few surprised me by adjusting slowly, awkwardly, but sincerely. I didn't chase repair. I let alignment determine what remained. What I learned is this. When you stop playing a role, you discover who actually wants you, not what you provide. There were moments of sadness. Of course there were. Letting go of an identity hurts, even when that identity was heavy. I had to grieve the version of myself who believed love had to be earned through endurance. But I didn't become bitter. Bitterness comes from unexpressed resentment, and I had expressed what mattered, not through arguments, but through action. Now, when I think of myself, I don't start with what I do for others. I start with who I am when no one is asking anything of me. I am steady, but not self-sacrificing. I am generous, but not extractable. I am calm, not compliant. I still care deeply. I just no longer confuse care with obligation. The quiet dominance people sometimes sense in me now doesn't come from control. It comes from self-trust, from knowing that I can withstand misunderstanding without collapsing, that I can hold boundaries without raising my voice. That kind of strength doesn't announce itself, it just stands. And that is who I am now. There is a particular kind of ending that doesn't feel like an ending at all. No doors slam, no credits roll. Life simply turns and continues, but on different terms. That's where I am now. When I look back on the version of myself who carried so much so quietly, I don't feel anger toward her. I feel respect. She did the best she could with the understanding she had at the time. She believed love was proven through reliability, that harmony was maintained through self-restraint, and that being easy was a form of kindness. Those beliefs weren't wrong. They were just incomplete. What I know now is this. Generosity without choice is not generosity. It's erosion, and boundaries aren't punishments. They're information. They tell the world how to interact with you without destroying you in the process. My family still tells the story their way. I don't correct it. In their version, I changed suddenly. I became distant, ungrateful, cold. In their version, my boundaries arrived without context. I've learned to live with that, because trying to control how you're understood is another form of self-abandonment. The truth, the one I live inside, doesn't need consensus to be valid. It only needs integrity. What surprises people most when they hear my story isn't the conflict. It's the lack of spectacle. There was no revenge arc, no public reckoning, just a woman who stopped overfunctioning and allowed reality to reorganize itself. Quiet dominance isn't about winning. It's about no longer participating in what diminishes you. If there's a moral here, it isn't cut people off or put yourself first at all costs. It's simpler and harder. Pay attention to what your silence is teaching people. Notice when your kindness becomes expected rather than appreciated. Understand that being needed is not the same as being valued. And most importantly, know that the moment you stop betraying yourself, someone somewhere will be disappointed. That disappointment does not mean you are wrong. Sometimes it means the system no longer works without your sacrifice. I didn't lose my family. I lost a role. And in its place, I gained something quieter, sturdier, and far more valuable, myself. So I'll leave you with this. Not as a challenge, not as advice, just as an honest question to sit with. Have you ever been called selfish for doing something that finally allowed you to breathe? If you feel comfortable, I'd like to hear your story in the comments.